Hello everyone. We are now going to create a simple sales report using tables and pivot tables in Microsoft Excel. We'll be working with the Sugar Factory exercise file, and let's just have a quick scan at the data set we'll be using today. So put the cursor within the data set, and then we can select all the data set by pressing Ctrl A to select all. And having done that, to have a quick view of the entire data set, you can hold down Control and toggle on the period button. And that will take us to the four corners of the data set. And we can see that the data runs from row 1 to 7,000 plus rows of different sales data. Now, tables are very useful for organizing and analyzing data set in Excel. And over the next few minutes, I'm going to show you how to use tables and pivot tables to really organize and analyze your data sets and derive actionable insights from the information gathered. So the first thing to note when you want to create tables is there are a few rules that you need to abide by before you start working with tables. So I'm just going to run through them very quickly. The first rule is that you need to make sure that you have a single row for your headings. And if you look at this data set, you can see that all the headings are on the first row, row 1. And if you just run through the different headings we have a field for the dates, transaction ID, the store ID, revenue ID, the drivers, which are pretty much the products being sold, the description, which are pretty much the categories, and then you have the price field, the volume field, and finally the sales field itself, which is the product of price and volume. Now, the first rule, like I mentioned, is to ensure that all the headings are just on one row, and best practice is to have it on the first row of your data set. The next rule is to ensure that there are no empty columns within the data set. And what do we mean by empty columns? If you look at the data set, you will see that it goes from A to I and there are no empty columns. An empty column might look like this view. I'm just going to illustrate. So if we had a column like column B, which is pretty much empty, this doesn't meet the best practice for working with data set and creating table. So you want to ensure that whenever you're trying to do analysis in Excel, you do not have empty columns within your data set. The next rule is to ensure that you also do not have empty rows. Just like it's not a good practice to have empty columns within your data set, having empty rows like this also doesn't help with the analysis, because what you've pretty much done is to divide the data set into two, and then when you try to analyze it, it might not capture the entire data. So as a rule, you want to ensure that you do not have empty rows or empty columns within your data set. The next rule is to ensure that you do not have subtotals or grand totals manually imputed in the data set. So it's not uncommon to see people try to calculate the total sales right within the data set and enter formulas like sum right here. That's not the best practice. As working with tables, you have access to inbuilt functions, which I'm going to show you how to use within the next few minutes. But bear in mind that whenever you're working with tables and pivot tables, you don't need to have subtotals or grand totals within the data set. And finally, you want to ensure that every field within your data has unique data sets. And what do we mean by that? You can see that on the first field we have here is for dates. So the practice is you need to ensure that every record on this field are dates and not other data type like text or numbers. You need to be consistent with the data type. And just like where we have text data type for the products, you need to ensure that everything that comes into these fields are actually unique for product and are in text data type. Those are the 5 rules. I'm going to run over them very quickly just to make sure you capture them. The first one is to make sure you have single row of headings. The next one is to make sure there are no empty columns within your data set. And after that, make sure there are no empty rows. Also ensure that you do not have subtotals or grand totals embedded in your data set, because this can be automated using the inbuilt functions with tables. And finally, ensure you have unique fields for every data set within your information. All right, so once you've done that and you've complied with those rules, the next thing for us to do is to actually create a table. So even though this looks like it's already a table, it's actually just a normal range of cells within Excel. So to create a table, there are very easy steps we're going to run. And the first one is to ensure that your cursor is within the data area. So just put your cursor anywhere. You do not need to highlight the data set, just have the cursor within the data. And then go to the Insert tab. From your Insert tab, you will see a button for creating tables within the tables group. So you can select that. And from my screen, you can see that the shortcut for that is also Control T. So either you go into the Insert tab and select tables, or simply press Control T. That will bring up this table dialog box, and from within this dialog box you can see the information presented. The first thing is that Excel has automatically highlighted our data set. We can see that it goes from cell A1 to cell I7165, and that's the entire data set we showed earlier in the day. And then it's asking us if the table has headers, and we can see that the headings are currently on the first row, so we can make sure that we have that box checked. And once that is done, we'll select OK and have the table created immediately. Once a table is created, a contextual tab comes up in the main tab area, and we can see that there's a new tab called Table Design. This is the area where you go to design your table, name it, and do some other nice things within the ribbon area. So the first thing you always want to do when you create a new table is to rename the table. So to rename the table, from the Design tab, we'll see the table name area by the left hand side, and all we need to do is to type in the name of the new table. So I'm going to call this sales data. It's important to note that you cannot have special characters or space within the name box. So ensure that you either have a single word title, or you use the underscore to join more than one word together. So once you type in that, you can hit the enter key to let that go in. And we can now see that the table has been renamed from table 1 to sales data. The next thing we want to do is to explore some of the other design options for our table. And we can see right from the Design tab that we have some table style options here. So the first thing we can do is we can select the drop down to see some of the other options. And if you prefer to change the look and feel of the table, you can select a table design that suits your style and run with that. The next area of options are the other style options, and right from this window we can see that we have different options like the header row. If you want the header row to show you, ensure you check that box. You also have options for banded rows and banded columns, and if you don't want that, you can also uncheck that. Then earlier in the day, we mentioned that you should avoid subtotals and grand totals. If you need to show that, this is the area where you go into to enable the total row. And once you do that, the system automatically adds a total row to the last, after the last data in your data set. And by default, if you have numbers in there, it's going to use the sum function. But you also have options of changing the functions to either average, count, minimum, maximum, and standard deviation amongst others. But for now, we're going to leave it at the sum function, right? And so if you need to see subtotals, grand total, you can always use the total row button under the table design tab. I'm going to uncheck this now, and I'm going to run you through how you add new data to your table once you've created it. So to add new data is very simple and straightforward. All you need to do is go into the last row in the data set and just start typing. So if I was going to enter a new data for today, for example, I can enter today's date by simply typing, and then I'll press the tab key to select. You will notice that automatically this row is added to the table, and then we can continue populating the data with the new information. The same thing applies if you're trying to add a new field. So if I wanted to add a new field for, let's say, value added tax, I can simply start typing on the next field after the last column on the data set. And once I type in the value and pressing enter, it also adds that information to the table, and you can see that any information we put in here now automatically is part of our table. I'm going to delete this now because we don't need it. Now, within the design tab, we would have noticed that we had an area called the filter button. The filter button is very useful if you want to quickly sort your data or filter specific information just for quick glance, right? And you can see the filter button at the top right corner of every column within the data set. If you choose not to have that within your table, you can always uncheck it from the design tab area and it goes off. But I want to show you how to quickly sort your data using the filter button. So assuming we wanted to sort the revenue by amount, so from largest to smallest, we can go into the field for amount, click on the filter button, and then you will see the sort functions or the sort buttons. So you can select sort largest to smallest, and immediately that would rearrange the data, sorting from the largest to the smallest. You can also apply the sort on text fields like the description, and if I click on the filter button, I can say sort in ascending or descending order, A to Z or Z to A. So if we're to do A to Z, this is what it will look like, and then you can see that the data set goes from A to Z top down. So those are very quick ways of sorting the data. This button is also useful for filtering, and you can see that because I selected a text field, it's showing me that I could use some text filters if I want to use specific words, or I could simply search. So if I wanted to sort for sugar, I can type in sugar here and pressing enter, and now it's filtered the entire data set and is only showing sugar. So you can see at the status bar that is telling us that 3,607 data points have been selected out of a total record of over 7,000 plus, right? And then you will see a filter button showing at the top of the column that is filtered. This lets you know that the actual data set has been filtered, and to clear it you can also click on the same filter button and choose the clear option here. So that's one of the ways of filtering. But in the more recent versions of Microsoft Excel, there's a new feature which even enables us filter the data set better, and that's called the slicer. So with the slicer option, you get to filter your data set and also see which information has been left out. So to create a slicer, all you have to do is go into the table design area and then choose the insert slicer button. And now from the different options, you can choose the fields you would like to use for slicers. And for this purpose, I'm going to use just the drivers and product category. So if I select those two and say OK, the slicers are inserted into the worksheet area, and I can move this away from the data set so I can visualize them clearly. I'm just going to resize them so it looks a bit neat. So to resize, you can select it and then reduce the size by clicking and dragging inwards. I'll do the same thing for the description slicer. Click, drag, and then release. So now that we have the slicers inserted, if I wanted to filter for just retail sugar, I can select retail sugar from there, and then it filters the data immediately, and I'm just seeing the retail sugar. If I also wanted to clear that, I can click on this clear button to clear that. And we could try other options of filtering, say for freight, and we can see the different options there. So slicers are a very good way to filter your data and interact with your data in a way that is very powerful. Now finally, for this video, I'm going to show you how to create a pivot table to summarize and analyze this data set. Like we saw earlier, the data runs from row 1 to over 7,000 rows, so it's very difficult for us to really make sense of this data from this view. So pivot tables are very useful to summarize the data, analyze it, and extract insights that can be actioned. So to do that, the first step you need to take is to make sure your cursor is within the data set. And once you have that, you will see that a table design tab comes up. Now I can click on the table design tab, and on the left hand side I will see a command called summarize with pivot table. So I can easily select that option to create a pivot table. Once you select the option, a dialog box comes up for the pivot table wizard. And from this dialog box, you can select the relevant options that you would like to run. So immediately you can see that the data selected is the table we just created, and it shows the name we gave to the table, which was sales data. The next information we need to provide is, do we want this pivot table on a new sheet or an existing worksheet? So since we don't have any report page within this workbook, I'm going to select the new sheet option and then say OK. So automatically the system creates a new sheet for us. We can see the new sheet here, and we are able to then create the pivot table. So now, after we've selected the Create Pivot Table button, we see this new view, which is a pivot table view right here. So by putting your cursor in there, you can see the fields list by the right-hand side. So this field list represents the entire data set we were working with, the sales data. And you can see that every column within the data set is represented here on the fields list. Right. The next thing you'll notice from the pivot table view is that two contextual tabs are created. So we can see the Analyze tab at the top corner. We can also see the Design tab. These two tabs are very important in how you create, analyze, and then visualize the different pivot tables and charts that you may want to create for your reports. Right. So in order to use the pivot table, it's important that you understand the quadrants at the bottom of the fields list. So I'm going to spend a few minutes explaining these four different buckets. So the most important one is the values quadrant, and this is where you put in fields for numbers or fact values where you're trying to analyze some or do some other operation on. So for example, if we're trying to create a sales report, what that means is that the sales value has to go into this data, the values quadrant, and then we can use other dimensions to complete our pivot tables. Right. So your other dimension fields, depending on the kind of report you're creating or the kind of view or story you're trying to tell, we either go into your rows area, the columns area, or the filters area. So traditionally, the rows, columns, and filters quadrants are meant for text fields like your labels, so your dimensions, your dates, and categories, descriptions, those sort of fields, whilst your number fields or your values fields are meant for the values quadrant. So let's do a quick example, and assuming we want to create a sales, I'm going to type in the name of the report here, sales by period, period being the dates. So to create this sort of report, we can drag the sales field, which is the amount field here, and drop that in the values quadrant. And immediately the total amount is inserted into the cell. And you can see that the heading is now showing sum of amount. So that's telling us that the system has summed up the entire values in the amount field. Now it's showing in a scientific format. We can always format the number by right clicking on the cell and choosing the number format option. So right from the number format option, we can select the type. So I'm going to use the currency option without the decimal places and then say OK. So now we can see the total sales for the period. But remember, we're trying to create a report of sales by period. So we need to drag the period field, in this case, the date field, and we can drop that into the rows area. And once we do that, we can see what our sales by period report looks like. To add some flavor to this report, we might decide that we want to also see the categories, the product category. So which products, give rise to this total sales of 738 billion. So we can drag the descriptions field here put it in the column to see how the report looks. And now you can see that in addition to the yearly dimension, we also have the product category, and we can see sugar, other income, and molasses. Right, so this is how you create a pivot table. Right from this view, we will notice that there is an expand button by the side of the years. If we click on this, it's going to show us the quarterly performance. And if we expand the quarterly performance, you can also see the monthly performance. So that's how we create pivot tables. There are other different functions and views you can explore, but we'll be looking at those later videos. Thank you very much.